Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers and the catering staff for putting together such a lovely day. So thank you. Nice for me to get out of.
No pressure.
That's nice for me to get out of Cornwall now and again. The title of this paper is. Oh yeah, before I go there. So in the weeks leading up to this lecture, I did that very frequent thing, which is I admitted that I was wrong. And I quickly redrafted the lecture. So we shall see. The title of this lecture is Why Should We Lose Our Chance of Personal Happiness? Intellectuals in Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion. And Malcolm Hulke, the author of Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion, was born out of wedlock, and he and his mother moved frequently to avoid creditors. When he applied to be a conscientious objector during World War II, he was denied and forced to join the Royal Navy, a grave punishment indeed. And after meeting Russian POWs in Norway, he joined the Communist Party of Great Britain in 1945. Now, he quit the party in 1951 because he didn't like the Soviet Union's hostility to Yugoslavia. And this set the pattern because he quit and rejoined the party probably about 3 times. I think the last time he quit was in 1965. And his first work on the long-running television program, Doctor Who, which is about an alien who goes around the universe in a police box-shaped time machine, was co-writing the epic serial The War Games with Terrence Dicks in 1969. And Hulke was known for avoiding simple plotting and characterization. In my stories, he said, the baddies aren't really bad because they're doing what they think is right. Now, his last story was Invasion of the Dinosaurs, which was televised in 1974 and subsequently novelized by Hulke in 1976. And the plot goes something like this. The TARDIS, which is a time machine, materializes in London where the Doctor and Sarah Jane discover the city is deserted. They get arrested by soldiers who explain that the city has been evacuated because dinosaurs are rampaging through the streets. Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart recognizes the Doctor and his companion and frees them. And it emerges that a disgraced scientist called Professor Whitaker is using a time scoop to bring dinosaurs to London to frighten away the population. But Sir Charles Grover, the last member of the cabinet left in London, is the true mastermind. His group of ecologically-minded volunteers will found a new society when, after clearing their time bubble of Londoners, the time scoop is inverted and the entire world, apart from London, will be returned to prehistoric times. It doesn't take an intellectual to figure out that Doctor Who and his companions stop Sir Charles Grover and Whitaker and then use their time machine against them. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to argue that Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion illustrates what can happen when the main objective of a well-educated population is personal happiness. In turn, how groups of well-educated people sometimes subscribe to the one-sided visions of intellectuals and the erosion of social cohesion to try and achieve this personal happiness. Now, what's interesting about Malcolm Hulke's novel is that despite being published in 1976, the main message of the novel seems to be better suited to the 21st century than the late 20th. In the years that followed World War II, the amount of students enrolled at universities began to skyrocket, partially as a result of government schemes to educate those who had served in the armed forces. In the 1960s, student numbers doubled in 7 years to 50,000. And this trend carried on through the 1970s. This amount is tiny, of course, compared to the 2.66 million students enrolled at UK universities in 2020 to 2021. But a good education, as we shall see, is hardly protection against newly minted notions supplied by certain intellectual figureheads or movements who foist their own sense of unimportance onto their followers in an attempt to show these followers that they are nothing without a common purpose enforced from the outside. Now, one of the pitfalls in talking about Hulke's novel, and perhaps talking about intellectuals more generally, is that it's difficult to define what an intellectual is. We could define an intellectual, for example, as someone whose core activity is high caliber thinking that gets done within the confines of a certain kind of knowledge and subsequently concurs with thinking done by other people in the same field. In other words, an occupation where the work begins and ends with ideas. This definition argues that by looking at an intellectual's ideas and the company they keep, we can determine fairly quickly how malevolent or innocuous they really are. Now, the problem with this is that it doesn't take change or development into account. It's almost as though an intellectual is born with his or her ideas. Thomas Sowell provides yet another definition, that intelligence minus judgment equals intellect. But it's surely the case that there are shades of judgment, just as there are shades of love, shades of kindness, shades of honesty. Were the Francophone intellectuals who made up Pol Pot's inner circle, who directed the activities of the Khmer Rouge without judgment? They no doubt made judgments, but the effects of those judgments are perhaps not the ones that we would choose. We could say the same thing about Egyptian intellectuals who formed the movement for independent universities during the Arab Spring. Their progressive efforts were followed nonetheless by the autocratic grip of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, but this does not make the judgments of those intellectuals invisible or void. In Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion, there are two central intellectuals who, whilst quite different, form a mutually advantageous bond. Professor Whitaker is perhaps the closest we get to Sowell's definition that intelligence minus judgment equals intellect. Whitaker has refused government funding because other scientists think he's a crank. He has contempt for animals, and when he isn't manicuring his nails, he's fantasizing about meeting Henry VIII or Oscar Wilde. Then he meets Sir Charles Grover, who evidently exploits his vanity. Whitaker doesn't care about Operation Golden Age on an ideological level. He only wants to prove what everyone believes to be impossible. And as a result, he is comfortable with having his own genius exploited by others. What makes Whitaker different from the conception of the intellectual as someone whose work begins and ends with ideas is the fact that he has constructed a time machine and is evidently a brilliant engineer. Despite also having that expertise in a certain kind of knowledge, which in this case makes Whitaker extremely, if not dangerously, narrow-minded. Sir Charles Grover, on the other hand, is someone who makes the mistake of conflating the mastery of one knowledge with wisdom of a more general kind. He founded the Save Planet Earth Society, published a book called Last Chance for Man, and is now the minister with special powers. There is no doubt that he performs high caliber thinking within a certain kind of knowledge. The problem with Grover, however, is that he seems intent on surrounding himself with people who agree with him instead of allowing the academic community to scrutinize his ideas. He is someone who wants a moral one-up on society because he wants to erase history and forge a new humanity without the same mistakes. But he's also guilty of having moral double standards because for all his talk of a pure, unpolluted world, it's apparent that he wants to destroy the world just because he doesn't like it. He's trapped by a well-meaning fallacy where in order to avoid ecological genocide, he has to commit ecological genocide. After all, the time scoop will erase human, animal, and plant life. In other words, Grover intends to be God and Noah rolled into one. And the way in which he lies to his well-educated volunteers about the means by which Earth will be, quote, swept clean and returned to its early innocence, unquote, speaks volumes about this man's judgments. They are not, perhaps, the kinds of judgments that we would make, but they are still judgments made by a rational, intelligent mind. Grover doesn't think that civilization, contemporary civilization, is in any way alive, and offers up the contradiction in terms that civilization has destroyed humanity as proof of this. However, if Grover can reverse time on the earth, then he can guide humanity along a better path. Grover is trying to preserve his vision of how the world is or ought to be. It's a preservation of the vision of the anointed, which gives license to the filtering out of information that runs contrary to Grover's vision. This manifests itself, for example, in Grover seeing ecological genocide as painless, and deception is necessary to recruiting good people. Then having the belief that there's moral virtue in deceiving those people about the means, but not the end, because the earth will be returned to an earlier, happier time. Yet despite all this, he refuses to kill the doctor to prevent his meddling in their affairs because they shouldn't descend to murder, because it would go against their high ideals. All this points towards someone who doesn't value the significance of truth and interpersonal communication. Grover is determined to preserve his vision by making truth subjective and meaningless, and his views are dangerous precisely because they're maintained by the consensus of like-minded peers and nothing else. Now, his like-minded peers are the people, volunteers for Operation Golden Age who no doubt were chosen because of their beliefs. They have in fact been told that they're going to a new planet called New Earth, but Grover's lied to them, and the spaceship that they're on is little more than a glorified set. Now, Grover makes the mistake, however, of trying to get Sarah Jane Smith out of the way by hypnotizing her and leaving her on the fake spaceship. An ex-athlete called Mark meets Sarah Jane when she wakes up and explains how they're on their way to a new Earth with clean air and a, quote, simple pastoral people, unquote, who they're going to guide so that the evils on Earth won't be repeated. He says they'll be like the Pilgrim Fathers who went to America, but Sarah Jane very kindly reminds him that the indigenous people in America didn't like the Pilgrim Fathers, and they're likely to repeat the experience on New Earth. Mark's not worried, though, because he says they're going to treat them, quote, kindly and decently, unquote. Now, this preordained colonial future is symptomatic of the pervasive collectivism that Western intellectuals were drawn to in both fascist and communist states. The collectivism that we see in Grover's volunteers, however, is a direct result of Sir Charles Grover's influence. They are not capable of fighting for truth for the simple reason that they have been the victims of Grover's own production of truth. Moreover, Henry Williamson, the British novelist and nature lover, was enthusiastic about Nazi Germany because he thought it ushered in a return to a more authentic and natural way of life. And the promise of a return to nature and of a greater sense of community is one that Grover has clearly made to his chosen flock. It is a promise of personal happiness. It is a desire, however, that is rooted in frustration and deprivation, not due to material economic reasons, but more because Grover's volunteers, like Donald Trump's supporters, don't feel respected. Aside from the ex-athlete Mark, who's actually quite sweet, there is an ex-politician called Ruth, who introduced a bill against the pollution of rivers, not bad going, and an ex-novelist called Adam, who now likes to work with his hands instead of his imagination. It's a little sad. Despite the backgrounds of these volunteers, they all feel as though they're in a special group. They're all experts in their respective fields, but they, like Grover, make the mistake of conflating the mastery of one knowledge with wisdom of a more general kind. There's little to say about their faculties of judgment. It's clear that they, like Professor Whitaker, have been deceived by Grover, who has used their well-meaning pomposity against them. Therefore, it is unsurprising that the ex-politician Ruth thinks that Sarah Jane has contaminated them. That's the word she used, contaminated, when she argues with Mark about emulating the Pilgrim Fathers. The reason for Sarah Jane's shock, I think, is the perception that intellectuals believe in free expression and are committed to defending it because they could not function without it. But Ruth and her colleagues also believe in the necessity of authoritarianism for maintaining a set of beliefs and punishing those who go against them. Sarah Jane gets sent for re-education to the reminder room, where she's forced to watch a scratchy film that says that housing blocks have no sense of community because the concept of the village has been wiped away by the conveyor belt system of mass production. It's yet another example of how Grover and his chosen flock are suspiciously disconnected from that humanity and therefore that nature which has wronged. They spread their ambivalence and subsequent idealistic self-assertion to cover all human civilization, which, in their view, has failed completely. Ruth is a kind of crystallization of this because she believes that the world is much too full of moral degradation, permissiveness, and lying when she finds out the truth about Operation Golden Age, that ecological genocide is a prerequisite for avoiding ecological genocide. She exclaims, quote, "Why should we lose our chance of personal happiness? I say we complete the plan," unquote. Her reaction says more about Sir Charles Grover, perhaps, than it does about her own convictions. For example, when Sarah Jane calls them all crazy, Grover says that he and his volunteers are the only ones who are sane. What does this insoluble conversation say about intellectuals like Sir Charles Grover, who foist their unimportance onto other people who've been led to believe that they need a common purpose, that an outsider has to give it to them. Grover and his chosen flock are an example of what can happen when the objective of a well-educated population is personal happiness, and how these people sometimes subscribe to the one-sided visions of intellectuals and the erosion of social cohesion to try and achieve this personal happiness. One potential example of this is the British public's strange relationship with the English boarding school. The English boarding school system often produces adults who lead driven lives behind socially acceptable masks, which amounts to a kind of controlled schizophrenia. Many of these adults are incapable of sustaining intimate relationships, either at home or at work. But the prevailing vision among the English intelligentsia and among the educated population more generally is that going to boarding school is a privilege. There's very little research assessing boarding schools and the human beings that they produce. The evolution of psychology and pedagogies in Europe and America hasn't touched the English boarding school system, which barrels on without proper scrutiny. George Monbiot, for example, says that we will not build a kinder and more inclusive Britain until we understand its peculiar cruelties. And Nick Duffel echoes this when he says that in order to change our politics, we'll have to change our education system, of which the English boarding school is an essential, if somewhat damaging part. But as it stands today, the people who pay the price of this one-sided vision are not only boarding school survivors themselves, but also the British public, whose senior judges, Foreign and Commonwealth Office diplomats, and civil service permanent secretaries consist largely of boarding school alumni. The convenience of hating the upper class, and of the upper class secretly hating themselves, instead of trying to mend the cause of the problem, can be construed as a personal happiness enjoyed by the majority of Britain. Another potential example is how the Leave campaign in the run-up to the Brexit vote was built upon simplifications of complex political issues, inflammatory rhetoric, and misleading information. Nigel Farage, Anne Whitaker, and Boris Johnson are public intellectuals with a one-sided vision of the world and how it ought to be. One of the groups who paid the price of this one-sided vision were Muslims and members of the Black and Asian communities who saw reports of hate crimes against them rise to 5 times the weekly average, all in the name of reversing perceived losses of privilege and status. The vision that personal happiness was taken away by being a member of the European Union. It's plain to see then that all these one-sided visions accomplish is the replacement of society with numerous tribes who, in the absence of their intellectual figureheads, are without purpose. If we take into account, for example, Ruth's anger when Sarah Jane Smith talks about love and kindness and honesty, then we can also assume that in the real world, these numerous tribes, regardless of their beliefs, are also without the capability for love, kindness, and honesty. Perhaps because the traditional beliefs that usually temper newly minted notions offered by people like Sir Charles Grover are missing in a population whose main objective is personal happiness. It would be a ludicrous world if people like Sir Charles Grover were disallowed from devising ways of giving humanity a second chance, however. The fact that there is no second chance is irrelevant if we identify the potential for rescue, regeneration, and betterment in Grover's otherwise unstable scheme. There is some truth then in the idea that villains are not necessarily evil because they're trying to do what they think is right. That is why it's more helpful to see Hulke's novel as a warning as opposed to a diagnosis. The coalitions founded by intellectuals in Egypt from 2004 onwards, regardless of what came after, are an important part of Egypt's modern history and symptomatic of a more general cultural revolution, which included theatrical companies and an increase in the number of bookshops. Never a bad thing. For writers like Hisham Matar, the fact that intellectuals like writers stand outside events is precisely what allows them to play a role. Therefore, it's important to remember that intellectuals like Grover and the people that they influence are the exception, not the rule. There's no doubting that the mushrooming of literacy and political power down the socioeconomic ladder has been a good thing and made the problems of the world more accessible to the mind. Yet we have to accept that this change in our environment in combination with the high rate of student enrollment in higher education, also produces a fertile soil for uninformed attacks on social institutions. And, in the case of Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion, a plan to destroy civilization through the erasure of history, simultaneously ratifying the unimportance of guilt and the impossibility of wrongdoing. So thank you.